the most interesting thing to start with, I think, is to talk about how Islam comes into being. It doesn't exist. Christians and Jews have existed for hundreds of years at this point. Tell us about the start of Islam.
Sure. So, as usual, especially nowadays, there's different approaches to history and there's conspiracy theories, etc. So what I'm going to give you is the traditional account of the coming of Islam, which Muslims believe and which Christians and non-Muslims in general also believe, and they have for centuries. And I only tell you this by way of preface because as of late, there's a lot of attacks on the early historicity of Islam and Muhammad, and did he exist, did he not exist? Much of it, I think, is kind of polemical. It's the same sorts of things that arose against Jesus, etc. So anyway, the standard theory, or sorry, the standard idea, the rise of Islam, of course, is tied up to the person of Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, who's born around 570 AD in the Arabian Peninsula. And by the time he's 40, around 610, he starts having revelations, as he calls it, by the angel Gabriel, who tells them, Iqra. Iqra is the word we get Quran from, which means recite. And so he supposedly starts reciting what becomes the Quran, the verses. And this goes on year after year, for decades, actually. And these are all, so now you have the Quran is supposedly based on that, and you have surahs, which is essentially chapters made of ayahs, which are verses which he supposedly recited because Gabriel told him. And these are supposed to be understood as the words of Allah, the God of Islam, of Arabia, the God. In fact, the word Allah is el-ilah. It's in Arabic, it really means God. So it's, when they translate it as God, that is not unfair. I prefer using the proper name Allah because it's more distinct. At any rate, so Muhammad does all this and he starts reciting and telling the people around him, the Arabians, who are by and large polytheists at this time, especially he comes from the Quraysh tribe. He starts essentially, he presents himself in a long line of the prophets that everyone knows about, all the way from Abraham to Jesus, who of course is a prophet according to the Islamic tradition and according to Muhammad. And anyway, he preaches basically a sort of staunch monotheism. And that's why if you look at the Quran, there's a lot of things that, Christians and Jews would find agreeable. And then the important thing that we have to understand is that because I told you it goes on for year after year and it's in stages. And so it actually, the tone of what Gabriel's telling him to read kind of changes over time. And it really, if you look at it, it depends on if you want to look at it as a cynical non-believer, or if you want to look at it as a pious believer. As a cynical non-believer who's trying to read between the lines, who doesn't believe that Muhammad was necessarily being told to recite from God, whether he made it up or whether, it was an evil spirit talking to him. And these, of course, are the popular non-Muslim, especially Christian understandings of what Muhammad was going through. In fact, Muhammad himself, when he was first broached by Gabriel, thought it was a demon because it was sort of it physically attacked him and squeezed him and he was sweating, and he had to go to his wife Khadija and she told him, oh no, this is from God. Okay, so even in the Islamic tradition itself, it's a little curious.
But sorry, let me interrupt you very briefly.
Sure.
Who is Muhammad when he begins to receive these revelations?
He's a camel driver, and he's part of the Quraysh tribe, which is kind of noble, but he's a lesser noble he's an orphan, and he's being raised by his uncle. And at this time, he's very relatively unknown and insignificant, and he marries Khadija, who's an older woman and who is rich. She's got wealth, she's got property and livestock, and he starts essentially kind of working for her. So he's relatively an insignificant, obscure person in the larger scheme of things. And that's why in the beginning, so what I was trying to say is Muslims understand two stages. He starts off in Mecca. This is where he's young and where he's born and where he grows up. And this is where he starts getting his early revelations. So from, let's say, 610 to 622, those 12 years, it's what's called, when you look at the Quran, these are known as the Meccan verses. And at this time, Muhammad is essentially, as I just said, he's insignificant, he's weak, he's preaching, he's an itinerant preacher. And, he has like a handful of followers, and over 10, 12 years, he has maybe 100 followers. Most of them are family. And basically, so his message is not violent. It's all about you have your religion, I have my religion. So when you get moderate Muslims and they quote from the Quran, there are in fact moderate verses that say there's no coercion, la ikraha fil deen, which means there's no, literally, you can't be coerced in matters of religion. And like I said, you have your religion, I have mine. So he was preaching that when he was weak and outnumbered because he had to, because he had no military power whatsoever. And then eventually, due to his agitations, apparently the Quraysh, the polytheists, drive him out and they mock him. You're not a real prophet. You're making this up. You're a liar, etc. And he ends up going to Medina, at the time Yathrib. And there he starts getting a bigger following. And he becomes essentially a political leader now. And this is called the Hijra in the year 622. And he goes to Yathrib. And it's so important in Islam because it becomes year 1 in the Islamic calendar, 622. And he goes there and he becomes essentially a warlord. Okay. And now he starts going on raids against everyone who does not submit. Okay. So Islam, unfortunately, I always end up pronouncing things like an American. It's not Islam, it's Islam. And it's not Muslim, it's Muslim. And the two words are connected, right? A Muslim is one who does Islam. So you see the SLM. And what that means is submit or surrender. Okay. So that was it. So the one who is a Muslim is someone who is submitting and surrendering to Muhammad's call. Because if you didn't, you'd get killed at this point, now that he's gone to Medina and he's become a warlord.
To Muhammad's call or to the glory of Allah?
Well, they're the same, aren't they? Muhammad's presenting it as, if you do what I say, you're doing God's will, because I'm the prophet. I'm the last prophet who has come to correct. And the other thing, he positioned himself as the last prophet, meaning there's been a succession of prophets from, like I said, Abraham, Moses, etc., all the way to Jesus. And but the problem is Christians and Jews, even though they were given scriptures, they're known as the people of the book, they've over the years distorted it. So, for example, when it comes to the person of Jesus, he was just a prophet, but the Christians made him into the Son of God. And so, for example, in the Quran, you actually have thundering verses that are attacking Christians and calling them infidels or kuffar, which is a very bad designation, because they make Jesus to be the Son of God, as one example. And then also attacks on the Trinity and so forth. So he presents himself as, I'm coming to basically straighten out the true religion, which these Christians and Jews were handed, but they've ruined it. And that's why they say till today, the Bible or the New Testament, the Old Testament, whichever case has been, Muslims claim, has been tampered with. It's not the original. Okay, and I gave you the perfect example about Jesus. So they say that that's been added in later and so forth. Anyway, so he goes on the war path and it becomes jihad. And that's just a word which means to strive and to struggle. And I always find it ironic because the apologists for Islam, or let me go back a little bit. Orientalists back in the day, Europeans, when they would translate the word jihad, and they had to do this, they would just usually translate it to holy war, which was fair. I mean, it's legitimate. You can't, when you're translating words, you can't just sit there and break it down and get into the etymology. So that's what they do. But then the apologists lately say, no, it doesn't mean that. It means strive and struggle. And it does. But the irony is that actually makes it worse. And it just shows you how multi-tentacled the idea of jihad is. Because, so yes, it does mean strive and struggle, jihad, which was introduced again by Muhammad, especially now in this final phase when he's in Medina and he's on the war path. But historically, the only way you can struggle and what is it you're trying to struggle and do? Like you said, you're trying to bring Islamic rule. You're trying to bring the glory of Allah, okay? And the logic is, and according to Islamic teaching till today, Islam must continue to spread, including by force. Not that you have to convert by force. You're not supposed to force people to convert, especially if they're people of the book, because they're kind of close enough. But Islamic law has to govern the whole globe. And so if you are a Christian or a Jew, you have to live in tribute, pay tribute, and you're like second-class citizen. And if you're not, you do have to convert if you're a pagan, if you're a Buddhist or a Hindu. Theoretically, you're supposed to convert or die. You can't even pay tribute. So I just tell you that to give you the idea. So when they do jihad and they say it means to strive or struggle, that makes it all the much worse, because historically the only way you're going to spread Islam was through force and violence. But who's going to accept it? You're not in Europe, for example, when the time came for the jihad to enter there, Europeans fought tooth and nail. I'm sure we'll get into that. But today, of course, you are able to trick people and empower Islam, not through force. So today you can do, there's all these classifications of different kinds of jihad, which is different forms of struggle. And they actually have, I can give you quickly their names in Arabic. jihad al-lisan, jihad of the tongue, jihad al-qalam, jihad of the pen, jihad al-mal, jihad of the money, wiladat al-jihad, or basically the baby jihad. All of these in their own way help empower Islam. So with your mouth, you can engage in propaganda. With your money, you can support disseminating Islam. You can support terrorist groups. And with your womb, women are encouraged to have as many kids as they can, Muslim women, and men also to impregnate women, including non-Muslim women, with their seed. So you can, inundate the world with Muslims. And these are actually, this isn't me theorizing. This is actually lots and lots of Islamic clerics modern day clerics, articulated what I'm telling you right now. And, obviously I jumped from Muhammad to this to give you an idea of what jihad is. Yeah. But historically, during his time, you can't get away with that stuff. You're not going to, through propaganda or lying, trick anyone, because everyone had their own faith that they were going to fight to the death for.
So he goes on the warpath. He wages jihad. How much is he able to secure in terms of land by the time of his death?
Almost the whole of Arabia, as we know it. Yeah, but there's still, it's funny too, because a lot of them just in the Hinter regions, not all of it, but a big chunk of it. And his ultimate goal was Mecca, which, he was driven out and then he came back and he conquered it. But a lot of the Hinter tribes kind of paid lip service. And then once he died, it was interesting because what happened immediately was the Ridda Wars, which is known as the Wars of the Apostasy. Right when he died, it was all these tribes, especially that were away from the center, immediately kind of were like, okay, so the jig is up, he's dead. We're going back to our ways. And the first Caliph, Abu Bakr, waged another new jihad against the apostates.
What does Caliph mean?
Khalifa, which Khalifa in Arabic means successor. So he's the successor of Muhammad. And a caliphate is a form of governance based on the successors of Muhammad.
Just come back to Muhammad for 1 second, because it's quite an extraordinary story. A man, not particularly anybody really, preaches the revelations that he's got, gets chased out of the city he's from, goes to another city, and then suddenly he's a warlord who effectively conquers a huge swathe of land. What do we know about Muhammad that meant that he was able to do this?
Well, keep in mind, by the time he dies, it's not really a huge swath of land. We're talking about the Arabian Peninsula, which looks large, but it's mostly desert.
Yeah.
And he has control over various tribes. And I think what you're getting at is ultimately, it's not he himself. 1 century after Muhammad, Islam now governs all of North Africa, all of the Middle East, and is in the middle of France. So that's the historical kind of conundrum that a lot of people have been wondering about. How did it does, of course, start with Muhammad.
Yeah.
And, how did it go from this guy who was just sitting in a cave talking to Gabriel to a century later, essentially, they've conquered most of what was the old Roman world, and most of it on Christian territory, and even further east into outside of the Roman Christian world. So that's always been the great riddle. And earlier historians, including those who were contemporary, believe it had to do with the fusion of jihad, the doctrine of jihad. Because up until then, look, you had war, people engaged in war, non-Muslims engaged in war, Christians engaged in war, but especially with Christians, it became a just war type thing, and there were limitations to how you can do it. But with Muhammad, he basically, what I always say is the genius of Muhammad, which goes to your question, is that he basically fused the sort of tribal mores of his society and re-articulated them rather than fused, but he fused them with theology and re-articulated them through sort of a theological paradigm. So they became, okay, so what is tribalism? The tribalism of Arabia, which also prevailed in most tribal societies, pastoral societies, was basically, what is tribalism? It's me and my kin, that's it. Everyone outside of the tribe is the enemy. That's how tribalism works. It's not that we're not your friends. You are the enemy. You exist for me to kill and plunder and enslave and do whatever with. And the tribe, of course, the closest is the nuclear family, and then it keeps spreading, cousins and whatever. So it keeps growing. What Muhammad did is he maintained that paradigm, which was integral to the Arab society that he was born in. But like I said, he re-articulated with these Islamic teachings. So now you still hate people. The Quran commands Muslims to hate, not outside tribal people, but anyone who's not a Muslim. And you can see how that's tribalistic, because we are the ummah, right? The nation, we are the Muslims, Everyone outside of it, we are commanded to hate. And this is in the Quran. This is Quran 64, where Allah says you have a good example in Abraham or Ibrahim, and this gives you another really good example of what I'm talking about, how Islam appropriates the biblical figures, but recasts them in a way that validates itself. So we know the Abraham from the Old Testament in the Bible, he leaves what God calls him, he leaves, the land of Ur, and, he begins the great migration towards the Holy Land, which eventually gets conquered, Joshua, etc. But when he leaves Abraham in the Bible, there's nothing about hating anyone. In the Quran, all of a sudden, Allah tells Muslims, you have a good example in Abraham, because he told his kin, we hate you and enmity will last between us until you believe in Allah alone. And so that became sort of an Islamic, and in the Quran, it also says similar things about how a true Muslim he has to have these feelings and disassociate from his father, his mother, his brother, his wife. I have an Islamic cleric recently who I translated a while back, who literally says, because of this doctrine, you can, as a Muslim, marry a Christian or a Jewish woman, people of the book, because that is permitted in Islam, but you have to hate them. And you have to show them you hate them. But you can copulate with them, and but you always have to make sure they know you hate them. Okay, so this is an ironclad teaching. And as you can see so this is tribalism, of course, 101, but now it has a theological veneer. And then, so what do you do in tribes? We hate each other. Well, I go and I plunder you, right? So that became jihad. Jihad is warfare on the outsider, who I am already bred to hate. I could say, in a secular setting, tribalism doesn't necessarily, I wouldn't say teach you to hate the outsider. You just fear him. They're outsiders, and you can kill them. But it's much more when you really hate that person. And this is something we can get into, because this is the heart of the matter. To me, this doctrine that I'm belaboring, and in Arabic, it's a dichotomized doctrine. It's called al-wala' wal-bara', 2 Arabic words. Wala' means loyalty and love for Muslims, which we can put that aside. And what I'm looking at is the bara', which is hatred and enmity for non-Muslims. Okay, and so that manifests in jihad. And so anyway, and then if you die, right, so you're the warrior, you hate the infidel, you do jihad. Now, in a secular setting, that happens all the time, historically, even in the present day, and people go fight to plunder, right? But now, if you win, well, you get all these, the booty, animate and inanimate, you can gain. But if you die, you get even more. Now you go straight to heaven, straight to paradise, where it's, again, hedonistic and materialistic, and you get women, and, it's very carnal, the way it's described in the Quran, okay? There's beautiful boys circulating around looking like pearls, and these supernatural women who you will copulate with in perpetuity, who are made specifically for sex, okay, and rivers of wine, etc.
Rivers of wine?
Yeah. Now you can drink wine once you get to heaven, but not here. I'm sorry, maybe rivers of honey or wine, but I know there is wine.
Sorry, I just that just took me.
It might something. It's poetic language is being used.
Okay, right.
And but definitely, but I do know alcohol is permissible then, because that's something they talk about. So my point is, the genius of Muhammad, if you're asking, is that he just took that tribalism but rearticulated it in a way that it became a win-win thing. So now, when I go and plunder the outsider, the non-Muslim, the infidel, I'm the good guy now. I'm pious. And if I win and I subjugate, kill, whatever, take and conquer, well, then, I'm even more righteous. And if I die, I get the highest level of paradise. So that was one of the earliest interpretations by non-Muslims as to the efficacy of jihad. It's not very popular nowadays. Your average secular historian will laugh at this and tell you, no. But your average secular historian will also tell you no one really knows how to explain the Arab conquests and how rapid they were, because, they shouldn't, by any means, they should not have done what they did. The most popular theory is that the two contending powers that the Arabs eventually in the 7th century conquered, Rome or Byzantium, and the Sasanian Persians, were so weak because they had been fighting each other. So that's kind of the most popular theory, but still, I don't think that's convincing in and of itself.